So good evening. I'm Alex Krieger, the interim chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design, and in that capacity, it is my pleasure to introduce three distinguished individuals who will lead us in a discussion about how to apply theory to planning practice. Now that strikes me as a particularly interesting topic to have at the GSD, as we at the GSD, and not just in our department, maybe even more so in the others, we enjoy theory. We enjoy theorizing. Maybe even some would even argue that we're enamored of theorizing about all kinds of things, about the responsibility of our professions, about their intellectual underpinnings and how we might adjust those, about how to sort of redirect the focus of the professions or the value systems involved. But we don't often enough actually talk about what an effective way it would be to affect practice through our theorizing. So, well, this evening we're going to learn something about that, and at least in the context of urban planning. So let me introduce the three participants tonight. First, Professor Susan Feinstein, who will set the stage for the discussion, and then she'll be joined by Balakrishnan. Oh, he's a little bit difficult to pronounce, I apologize, and Cuz Potter. They will join in the conversation, and then ultimately, which I hope will involve all of you as well. Professor Feinstein is a senior lecturer and research fellow currently at the design school, but she was a long-standing member of the faculty. Her book, The Just City, was published way back in 2010, but is still extremely relevant, extremely popular, and is required reading in a number of planning programs, as it should be and should remain. Among her other publications are The City Builders, Property Politics and Planning in London and New York, Restructuring the City, and Urban Political Movement. She has edited a number of volumes on a number of sort of diverse subjects, including about urban tourism, planning theory, gender studies, and has well over 100 chapters, which is kind of amazing, in articles in various other publications. In addition to being a long-standing member of our faculty here, she was also on the faculty at Columbia University and at Rutgers University. And she's been a visiting professor at a number of other institutions, including the University of Amsterdam, the National University of Singapore, also for quite a while an editor of the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and has been a consultant to a number of organizations and public organizations around the country and abroad. Sai Balakrishnan is an assistant professor of urban planning at the Graduate School of Design, currently, about to be promoted, I'm guessing, and predicting. So you heard it here first. Prior to this, she was an assistant professor at Rutgers University and served as a postdoctoral scholar at Columbia Law School's Center for Global Legal Transformations, which is kind of a mouthful. She's also worked as an urban planner in the United States, in India, and in the United Arab Emirates, and as a consultant to the United Nations regarding Nairobi, Kenya. She has served as a research fellow as well at the Land Governance Laboratory in Cambridge, it's a kind of Cambridge-based nonprofit organization that deals with inclusive land resource allocations in rapidly urbanizing countries. Professor Balakrishnan focuses on institutions for governing rapid urbanization and on the spatial politics of land use and properties. Her work has been published in a number of different sort of venues, and her own book called Shareholder Cities, Agrarian to Urban Land Transformations Along Economic Corridors in Liberalizing India, is forthcoming from the University of Pennsylvania Press, a Distinguished University Press. It is out. Just out. Bravo, yes, right. Cos Potter is just here off the plane virtually from Korea, not exactly a short commute, is currently Associate Professor of International Development and Cooperation at Korea University's Division of International Studies. His current research focuses on the role of the Korean construction industry in the uneven spatial development that occurs throughout sort of the developing world, especially in Myanmar and Vietnam. He has co-authored work on Nairobi slums for the World Bank, on U.S. urban revitalization for the Korean government, urban entrepreneurship in China, and on industrial districts and their role in various sort of rapidly developing countries around the world. He is the editor and contributor to Searching for the Just City, which happens to be an engagement among a number of colleagues dealing with, of course, Susan's book, Susan's concept of just city. So with that, let me just make a couple of other remarks, as I've been instructed to do by our well-managed handlers that we have at the moment at the GSD. So we need to kind of always thank our sponsors, and so this event is supported by the Sylvester Baxter Lecture Fund. We have to be kind to our funders and donors, of course. And I'm also asked to identify the next 3 public events here in Piper. Well, actually, on Monday, October 28th, Teresa Galley-Izzard will give a talk at noon in Stubbins. Yael Bartinia will deliver a lecture to mark the opening of the exhibition Love in a Mist, which sounds kind of endearing. Wednesday, October 30th, right here at 6:30 in Piper, and on October 31st, Frida Escobedo will deliver an open house lecture in Piper, again here also at 6:30. And particularly for the planning students, you will have occasion to interact with the planning directors of the largest American cities who are here for their annual conference this coming Monday evening. So good job-getting opportunities as well, in addition to just engaging with these planners. So finally, please welcome Professor Feinstein.
Well, thank you. It's really exciting for me to be here. I came to Harvard as an undergraduate. I won't even begin to tell you how many years ago. Then I taught here for a number of years during this century, so there was quite a large gap in between. But Harvard is very close to my heart, I guess I would say. I should also mention that my colleagues on this evening, Kuz and Sai, were both my doctoral students at different times, and of the things that I have enjoyed most in my years as a professor, it's really been working individually with students. Now, I teach planning theory, and the problem with teaching planning theory is that students taking planning theory want to know what is it good for. That, okay, we can philosophize if we will, but the point, I think as Marx said long ago, is the point is to change the world. And what's exciting about teaching planning, I should mention my own degree is in political science. My thesis advisor is right here, actually. But political science is a discipline, or sociology, any of the social sciences, so-called, are concerned mostly with, in fact, explaining and describing the world, or perhaps predicting, but not telling people how to act in the world. That's probably an overgeneralization, but by and large that's true. Well, you teach planning, and people want to know why they're sitting in a theory class, that they're going to go out and be planners. They may work for city government, they may work for national government, they may work for international organizations, they may work for community organizations, but practically none of them is actually going to become a professor. So that the way in which in the disciplines you're really training people to do what it is you do, that isn't what you do as in planning. So the question that I address in my courses is, what can planners actually do to create more just cities? I got started studying urban politics when it was hardly developed as a field, partly prompted by, first, a hope that urban renewal, which was a relatively recent program at that time in the United States, had the capacity to transform cities for the better, then being concerned that, in fact, what urban renewal was doing was damaging cities and damaging especially the less advantaged people who lived in them. The term slum clearance is not used much in the United States now, although it's still used in other parts of the world. And the idea was somehow if you just got rid of the slums, that the issues that created slums and the people who lived in them the problem would disappear. So the issue then that got me started was, what could planning do to help those people who were minorities, who were disadvantaged in terms of income, ordinary people who were not benefiting from these programs? Well, it was a period of popular rebellion in cities, particularly against urban renewal, and especially, actually, Boston was one of the centers of these rebellions. In collaboration with my husband, Norman, who is here somewhere, there, that we both did research for our dissertations and ultimately for a book called Urban Political Movements, which was based on an idea that if one, in fact, involved grassroots groups, community groups, and developing programs with them, that you could put pressure on city governments and transform the way in which cities were being redeveloped. So at that time, I think somewhat naively and idealistically, I saw community-based movements as the most effective way of changing the distribution of benefits from planning programs. This is a picture, this is actually not from the 1960s, but more recently in New London, Connecticut, where in a kind of throwback to 1950s, 60s style urban renewal, they eliminated a neighborhood in the hope that Pfizer would come and build its World Research headquarters there. And there were some holdouts, and as you could see, they weren't very happy about this. But in fact, they did tear down the neighborhood, and in fact, Pfizer did not build its world headquarters there, which is what happened quite a lot of the time in urban renewal programs. Now, in the 1970s, two profoundly influential books within the field of urban theory came out, Manuel Castells' The Urban Question and David Harvey's Social Justice in the City. And what they really introduced in a way that people hadn't figured out quite until then was the way in which space, spatial relations, location, affected the way people lived and the distribution of benefits in society. That property owners were controlling in terms of physical development, and the way in which they sought to transform space was increasing inequality. Now, these two books, which certainly were insightful and certainly profoundly affected me and many others, at the same time they implied, if not said outright, that there was nothing you could do except have a revolution. Now, when you're teaching planners, that's not that useful to say to them, well, either you can get out on the street and lead a revolution, or you can sit around and do nothing, but there's nothing you're going to do that does any good. So I thought it would be better to try to identify ways in which planners, in fact, could do some good. And I engaged in comparative research because I looked around and I said, well, there are countries where, in fact, planning produces social reform, where planning does especially through the development of housing for low-income people and the development of effective transit systems, that it was doing good for people. And how could we explain that in some places it did more good than in others? If capitalism was like a lock and every place that was capitalist was going to be the same, then how did we explain difference? So I looked at that time to Europe, where there was greater income equality, where there was less uneven development, where the government seemed to be more on the side of people with fewer resources. And in particular, I went to Amsterdam, mainly because a student I was going to go to Stockholm because that's in the United States. What you heard was the place that was the most progressive, but I had a student at Rutgers who said, well, don't go to Stockholm because it doesn't tell you much. It's a very homogeneous place. What you need to do is go to Amsterdam, where he came from, which is much more diverse, much more interesting, has a much more interesting politics. So I said, okay, I'll go to Amsterdam and let your parents take care of me, which they did, which was helpful. And also they were very well connected and introduced me to all the people I might want to interview. And at that time, Amsterdam was really providing a great deal of social housing. It had economic development. It wasn't that they said they didn't care about growth. They did care about growth. But at the same time, while providing incentives to developers, it was redistributing the benefits of economic development. By some sheer coincidence, I sat on an airplane next to a fellow who was some kind of consultant and was the head of a firm, and he said that he was going to Amsterdam where he was American, but he was going there because his firm was headquartered there. And I said, why did you pick Amsterdam? And he said, well, they had these training programs for people, which meant that he could recruit staff who were trained to do what he needed, and they would tailor-make these training programs just for whatever it was he did. So that was one of the things they did, which was a lot different from saying, well, we'll tear down your small businesses and build a big office building and hope that somebody comes and fills it up. So I interviewed a lot of people in Amsterdam, was impressed by their commitment to using the public sector and using planning to create a more just society. Now, Amsterdam, unfortunately, has diminished this commitment substantially, and there are reasons which I'm not going to go into here. But then, as another kind of coincidence in my life, after I retired here at Harvard, I was asked by a colleague who just happened to be passing me in the hall, was I interested in teaching in Singapore? And I said, well, you know, I hadn't really thought about teaching in Singapore. In fact, I wasn't sure I could locate Singapore on the globe, but sure, why not? So I, again, jointly with Norman, taught in Singapore for 7 semesters over 7 years. And Singapore has issues, which I'm sure you all are aware of, and it doesn't have to do with people not being allowed to chew gum, which is a rather minor thing that somehow people always mention when Singapore is mentioned. Singapore is very inclusive in terms of its citizen population, but exclusive in terms of people who aren't qualified as citizens. But for the citizens, the great majority live, in fact, in public housing. Something over 80% live in public housing. The public housing sits on land that is ownership is retained by the public sector. And so what this means is that there is simply not the kind of speculative development that exists in most other parts of the world. There's also the most meticulous planning, so that if they develop what they would call a new town, and we would probably call, a neighborhood. But a new town would have a couple of 100,000 people in it, and it would be built not just the housing, but also the recreation, the shopping opportunities, the education, the schools, that would be a new town that was built whole and which was sensitive to the needs of people in various income strata. including one of the institutions that they arrived at, not purposefully, but which has been very important, is in order to get vendors off the streets, they put them in what they call hawker centers. And the hawker centers, which serve both cooked food and also sell groceries and sell all kinds of things, actually, are places where everybody goes, whether they're wealthy or whether they're poor. So they're places that are diverse or heterogeneous. And I might add that Singapore's population, although majority Chinese, has a substantial Malay and Indian population, and every single one of these public housing blocks has to represent each of these populations proportional to their population in the country. So here's some pictures of Amsterdam. The area there that's called this area is called Newmarket, and that was by a progressive socialist government slated to be torn down and urban renewed to build modern housing, which they at that time thought was a good thing. And there were massive protests. The protesters prevailed, and the area, in fact, has been retained as a mixed area. The only irony of it, which is the irony of many historic preservation efforts, is that it has been increasingly a tourist area and increasingly commodified, but still a number of the people living in those places are originally squatters who then were legitimized. And this picture here, this is an area that's called the 19th Century Ring. Around the center of Amsterdam is entirely a historic district, but this area they thought, well, they'd build denser, they'd build more modern buildings, and again, it was protests that prevented it from happening. But what you saw at that time in the Amsterdam government is that they responded to popular protests in quite constructive ways. This is Singapore public housing, and on the left is older, on the right is newer. And what you see is that the buildings are not, are kind of bland, and maybe you might even say sterile, but on the other hand, they put so much effort into landscaping, and they make the outdoors so nice that it's okay. They've conformed to a model that's a combination of Le Corbusier and Ebenezer Howard. That is, these are garden cities, or they call themselves a city in a garden, but at the same time, they do go almost entirely for high-rise. So my examination of these other cities led to my argument that how issues are framed is really key to whether or not planners are going to play a progressive role, but that planners themselves can play an important part in this framing. So that part of it is that if, as planners, you're full-time. One of the things Max Weber long ago said is that the people who were bureaucrats had control of a very precious resource, which was information. Or he actually said the files. And you have this picture of these long rooms with green file cabinets in them. Well, now it's, it's on computers, but it's still, planners are the ones who do have the information about cities and can frame issues in ways that they use their information to, in fact, talk about progressive policies. And if you talk about progressive policies all the time, instead of saying, oh, well, this is what we need to do to be competitive, this is what we'll do to get growth, then you're going to have a different planning process than if you say, oh, well, what we really have to do is get growth by hook or crook, however we do it. But also in doing comparative research, what I realize is how important the national political structure is. And without a national political force that is progressive to provide a framework for local planning, that local planners are pretty much hamstrung. So to go back to my original question, that I was concerned with what were the forces that would create more just cities, I would argue that planners can contribute to it by figuring out policies for dealing with housing and homelessness, for dealing with transit for people who are reliant on public transit, to make public space accessible. That they can do all these things, but they can't do it by themselves, that it's always part of a framework, which is both an institutional one and an ideological one. So there is, one of the things about orthodox Marxism is it tends to say, oh, well, there's an interest that's the interest of the capitalist class. But in fact, there are different parts of the capitalist class which have different interests and define. So one of the things in Europe, in fact, in Amsterdam, I inquired why it was that developers there didn't mind that they couldn't make big profits, that they were kept from being speculative. And the response was, well, they like that everything's so predictable, and that an investment will produce a predictable return. Well, that's different from the kinds of developers we usually get in New York who want to make windfall profits. So how they construe their interests and whether they see state planning as conducive to their interests or not depends a great deal on the framework in which they're operating, the expectations that are laid upon them, and that part of the role that planning plays by specifying policies which are progressive is to create the part of the framework that then comes back and allows them to do various things. Thank you.
The process will go that I will speak for about 5 minutes, and then Cy will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion and between us and then amongst you. And first, let me say I want to thank the ASOP, the Association for European Schools of Planning, for initiating this project to begin with. It really was a privilege to go through Susan's work systematically. And I would definitely like to suggest that you all also go back to some of this late 70s, early 80s work in which she addresses this orthodox Marxist framework. Is really, I think, quite productive and was very informative for me for understanding the remainder of her work since. We tend to focus on the more recent work instead of looking back. But I'm going to focus on the more recent work, the Just City in particular. And that's because I think that recent events in Hong Kong kind of offer us some new provocations for thinking about the Just City and how we can how we should think about justice going forward. As I would presume many of you know, there have been weekly, almost daily protests in Hong Kong since May, 20 weeks now. And the Hong Kong protesters are making 5 demands, not one less, which reduce ultimately to, in my view, a demand for rule of law and democratic process. And I see this in my kind of pessimistic, sort of apocalyptic view of our collective future as one of the most important sort of battles that we're all facing going forward. I think as global warming increases and amplifies the autocratic tendencies that we're seeing all over the world, that this fight against authoritarianism is going to become more and more important. And where can you find a much more authoritarian government than my Korea's neighbor, right? So I think that this is an incredibly important set of events that are going on there. And it's important for us to think about this in order to think about how we fight for our own ability to determine our own future, right? I mean, America is not a stranger to this tendency either, of course. So I think it gives us 2 provocations. And the first one I draw from Judith Sklar's book, Faces of Injustice. And it sort of has got me, I'm quite enamored with this book, and it's got me thinking whether or not justice matters anymore. And that is to say, not justice per se, but in trying to develop positive normative prescriptions of justice, somewhat like the Just City book does. I'm not as convinced that that's as useful as it may, well, I don't know. It may not be useful going forward because justice is difficult to define. And we can come up with multitude of different definitions of what is just, although I think Susan would like to question that claim. Two, what was I going to say with that? Well, anyway. Right, so it can be difficult to define. But also that, in a sense, if we're thinking about the challenge of applying theory to practice, that is where the challenge is. And I think Susan does a good job of meeting it, but what Judith Sklar's book does for me is to suggest that it's really injustice that really matters for practice. Because what she basically argues is that it's the feeling of injustice, it's the experience of injustice that propels individuals to join in political and social movements, and that is what actually leads to change. So her view is that perhaps the focus needs to be on injustice. And so to that extent, I think thinking about Hong Kong is worthwhile. Perhaps we need an unjust city or an unjust city. Maybe it's easier, though, than writing about the just city. The second provocation that I think comes out of it is really more about the emphasis in the Just City book, in which, in my reading, and I was looking at it again and was just again blown away by just how amazing that book is. That Susan's basic position for setting up the book is that planning has focused on process and sacrificed or ignored outcomes and concern with outcomes. And so with the Just City, she's trying to shift that focus back to outcomes and away from process. But I want to try to push that balance back a little bit. Because what she does is she more or less talks about three facets of justice: equity, democracy, and diversity. And the way she presents it, and again, maybe she'll disagree later, is that democracy serves more as an instrumental good or an instrumental piece that brings forward substantive outcomes of equity. So I see her as putting process with democracy and equity with outcomes. And I think Hong Kong drives us to rethink this, because the equity story is Beijing's story, right? Beijing and Carrie Lam in Hong Kong are arguing that the source of the problem and the solution to the problem in Hong Kong is to provide more job opportunities and more affordable housing, right? This is the fundamental solution. In a sense, it's a very orthodox Marxist solution, that it is the economic conditions of the working class that is actually driving the protests here. But if you follow the Hong Kong protests at all and listen to the protesters, and I've spoken with some, that's not the concern. In fact, most of the young people who are protesting realize that they're actually probably risking and sacrificing their economic futures in order to obtain what they see now as something more important, which is democratic process and the ability to determine their own futures. And so I think with their focus on democracy, should push us to rethink the prioritization again of outcomes, and that we should be considering democracy or democratic process itself as an intrinsic good as well as an instrumental good. And so that's what I would like to offer, is that I think Hong Kong asks us to think about injustice again and about process as an intrinsic good.
They do it.
Okay. Well, firstly, it really is a privilege for both Kaz and me to be in conversation with Susan. As a former doctoral student of Susan's, when people ask me where I got my PhD, I sometimes jokingly, but not so jokingly, say the institution of Susan Feinstein. And I say this in recognition of Susan's immense contribution to institutionalizing the Planning Academy. Susan has supervised a large number of doctoral students in planning. She was one of the first set of faculty who set up the summer PhD workshop in the early 1990s at ACSP, the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. She was one of the founding members of FWIG, the Faculty Women's Interest Group. And many of us, including me, have been the beneficiaries of these planning institutions, right? So I just wanted to start by acknowledging Susan's contributions, not just to the canon of planning and urban theory, but really to the social life of the Planning Academy. So as a way of opening up a conversation with Susan and Kaz, I wanted to pose two questions. The first question is, does urban theory have a geography? Or another way of asking that question is, what is the place of place in urban theory? And I, of course, ask this question largely motivated by my own research interests. I work on urbanization in South Asia, more broadly the Global South, and I know the Global South is a category that Susan is not very enthused by, but hopefully that's something that we can pick up in the conversation. So that's the first question. And the second is the title of this evening's conversation, which is, what is the relationship between urban theory and planning practice? So the first question, does urban theory have a geography? So as a way of posing this question, I wanted to get Susan's work in conversation with the work of another urban theorist with whom she's had very long constructive engagements and also very long constructive disagreements, that of David Harvey. And I was recently reading this chapter by Eric Shepard and Trevor Barnes on Harvey and Baltimore. And I hadn't realized how seminal Baltimore was for Harvey's urban theorizing. So apparently, Eric Shepard and Trevor Barnes talk about Harvey in the 1960s, and he spent an entire decade in Baltimore doing deep empirical research on Baltimore's housing market, right, including FHA mortgage activities. And then in 1973, he writes The Social Justice and the City. So The Social Justice and the City is largely derived from his housing research in Baltimore, but Baltimore does not appear in The Social Justice and the City. And that, by definition, is what urban theory is about, right? Urban theory demands an abstraction from the particularities of place. Urban theory demands that knowledge which is produced in a particular place is abstracted, it's generalized, so that that knowledge can then be generalized to all places. But in Susan's work, Susan, of course, theorizes, but you don't fully escape place. So London, New York, Amsterdam, more recently Singapore, all of these places are very present in your theories, right? And which brings me then to this question of what is the place of place in urban theory? And I think this is a particularly important question in light of critiques, particularly by the post-colonial theorists, who argue that all theories have geographies, right? Not only do all urban theories come from somewhere, all urban theories have geographies of power, right? So this then has deep implications for the work that we do as planners, both in planning scholarship as well as planning pedagogy. So that was the first question, does urban theory have a geography? And the second is the relationship between urban theory and planning practice. And I think this is a particularly important question because we do live in beleaguered times, right? In the United States, in India, Brazil, Turkey, we're seeing rising economic precarity. We're seeing rising majoritarian violence against minorities, rising xenophobia. And it raises this question of what is the role of a normative theory, like the just city, in contesting the production of unjust cities. And for me, what is very powerful about the just city is that Susan vests immense agency in planners. She vests immense agency in planning institutions and in institutions of the state. So when I was a doctoral student, Susan had pointed me to a book which was deeply influential for me, and the book was Gorillas in the Bureaucracy. And it was a very important book because it opened up the possibility that planners can be insurgents from within powerful institutions of the state, right? And I see the Just City as very strongly aligned with books like Gorillas in the Bureaucracy because it offers a vision of how planners can reclaim political power. But having said that, the second question that I had for Susan is, given her time in the design school, I would be curious on what she thinks about the role of design and design agency in the theory of the just city.
Okay. Well, when you were talking about injustice as being the key to why people protest, I think that's true. And that's in a way what I was responding to when writing The Just City, that there's a book I think that's called Protest is Not Enough. And the question is, okay, we've protested, we said this was really unjust, that they've destroyed our houses or they've destroyed our livelihood or whatever they've done. Well, what do you want them to do? And what I've always been troubled by on the left is let me just say it that way, an overemphasis on what we don't like and an insufficient program of what we do like and what we do want. And if we're saying planning has done bad things, if you're like James Scott and say that seeing like a state means that you can't distinguish among places, well, okay, we distinguish among places, we say there are needs here that are thus, well, we have to have some kind of program. And I think one of the problems of much of the recent protests we've seen, like Occupy Wall Street and all the other occupies around the world, is, okay, once they've occupied and everybody's noticed it and said, well, we don't like inequality, we don't like the 1%, well, then what? What are the actual programs that you want to see? And if you're a planner, what are the more specific programs having to do with those aspects of urban life that you're working with, which really are public space, public transport, housing. Those are probably the three most important. So it isn't saying that we shouldn't be concerned about injustice. It's simply saying that we have to do more than protest injustice. In terms of democracy, I think democracy is a good in itself, and that I would rather live in a country that is democratic than one that isn't. But at the same, and I don't see democracy as being simply instrumental. I think it is something that's desirable as a way of life. But at the same time, you can get into a kind of liberal framework which says that's all that matters. And that what I've objected to in terms of planning, the people who emphasize process in planning, is that they seem to not have any vision of what the end result of planning is, but simply see planners as kind of mediators, negotiators, people who are trying in some way to find out what the public wants. But the public can't know what it wants unless it has some assistance in framing it. And so what I do see is the role of planning, and Cy mentioned the book Gorillas and the Bureaucracy, which was written a long time ago, but was written by a couple, actually, who worked within the U.S. federal bureaucracy and found ways that they could, in fact, change things. And another person I know who worked for HUD, which by now I don't think has any much effect on anything, but at any rate, she talked about the ways in which she was a gorilla in that bureaucracy. So planners can, as advocate planners, work for outside groups, but planners work often for government. And so one of the questions then is, if you are working for government, how much can you say, well, competitiveness and economic growth isn't the only thing that we're concerned about, and that much of the Just City was a reaction to the way in which this framing of that's what urban planning's about leads to inequitable results. Cy raised the question of place and the difference among places. I might mention, it isn't that I'm opposed to the idea of seeing the post-colonial world, it's just the term Global South bothers me, because it's a geographical term. Most of the people who live in the alleged Global South actually live north of the equator, and so I've just never understood why this was the appropriate usage. Well, I know, but why use that term? I mean, post-colonial makes more sense, I think, as a term than South. And you have to be an insider, actually. You have to be among these theorists to know what anybody's talking about. If you went out in the street and asked people where they thought the Global South was, they might say, I don't know, Miami, or... So I think it's one of those terminologies which is one that is not, I don't regard it as that helpful, but that's not that relevant to the more general question of place. Now, place is made important really on the right talks about best practices all the time, and that basically says, well, whatever the place is, you can do the same thing wherever it is. If we've learned that they do this well in Minneapolis, then we can do it well in Nairobi too. That there's sort of a complete, the idea of best practices which consultants go from place to place, bringing the same boilerplate, essentially, that is an abstraction from place. And then on the left, it's an abstraction from place that really only Marxist theorists do it to an extreme, which is to say that the processes that go on everywhere are the same, because as long as there's capitalism, it produces the same set of processes and the same kind of results. And so my whole effort really in doing comparative research, which has always been place-based and case study-based, is to find out there are differences among places. How do we explain those differences as well as their similarities? And once you say, okay, there are these differences and there are these similarities, how do we explain them? Can we also move from that to say, well, what does this tell us in terms of what we can do in one kind of place as opposed to what we can do in another kind of place?
Well, on that, I'm curious to follow up with Cy's question there. I mean, as I understand it, the suggestion is that the theory itself is generated specifically from those places, and then, and I'm not sure exactly how you see this going, because once it reaches a level of abstraction, whether or not that is inapplicable to other places, even at the level of abstraction, or if it's just that the theory originates
well, I think any theory has to travel, right? Because otherwise you are talking about a very, very specific context. What makes something a theory is it has to be abstracted in some way from the specificities of the place. But you know, I do think there is a deeper question here on knowledge and power and the institutions of knowledge production, because it's been striking to me. You know, you could have brilliant scholars who are doing research, focusing on a neighborhood in Chicago, right, or a neighborhood in New York, and they're deriving these brilliant insights on urban theory, right, from neighborhoods in Chicago and New York. Extremely important work, right? But you also have scholars who are theorizing from Mumbai and Mexico City, and there is a provincialization of their research, and this is Latin American urbanization, right? This is Latin American urban theory, this is South Asian urban theory. So in some ways, my point is that there are institutions of knowledge production which allow certain theories to be generalized and certain theories to be provincialized. And it's a problem then because only certain theories count as urban theories, right? And it has implications on the scholarship that we are citing in our own writings. It has implications on the theorists that we're teaching in our classrooms. So it is a question then on the
you're
canon.
saying that there's a dominance of Western theory
Yes.
that marginalizes theory.
Yes.
I don't think one identifies theories necessarily by the location of the people who are making them, and that there's a lot of interaction that certainly the people who are developed theory, who are South African, for example, that much of what they use came out of Western theories, but or are, in fact, what one might call Western theory, but I'm not sure that it's identifiably Western as opposed to, Rob Sampson talks about Chicago, and what's her name, Watson, who's in South Africa, talks about South Africa. And I'm not sure that the extent to which people look at these theories is identifying who the person is and what institution they're associated with. In fact, theory that came out of South America was very influential in terms of development theory, perhaps more than from anywhere else. And that, people who, the University of British Columbia now, they're saying that people shouldn't fly in airplanes, that their faculty shouldn't, but that in fact, it's through the way in which scholars have met with each other physically, in fact, at conferences around the world that has led to a development of theory which I don't see as being so nationally based at all. And that I think that many Americans have been very influenced by what's come from the countries that you refer to as the Global South. There's sort of I'll just leave it at that.
The number of times that I've seen the concentric rings model of the Chicago school, right, here at the GSD, as though it's some kind of a naturalized sorting of land use patterns, and it's not, right? It's Chicago at a very specific period, early 20th century industrial capitalism, North America, but the way in which it gets universalized as a universal theory is problematic, right? So I guess in some ways...
Who teaches it without positioning it that way as a model to break?
Well, because you clearly teach in...
Not in a planning department.
But I don't know, I thought the Chicago school was kind of passé, to tell you the truth.
Well, I still see the concentric rings model very happily used.
Okay.
Maybe it's time to...
So, Susan, but I did have a question
okay.
on Singapore. If you could perhaps tell us about Singapore and your theorizing from Singapore as the just city.
Well, I think the most important thing about Singapore, which makes it in certain ways a socialist country, although they would never, ever, the people there admit it, is that there's not only public land ownership, but there's public control of how that land is used. So to go back to Cuz's point about democracy, they could use a lot more democracy in Singapore, but they're pretty good on diversity. Well, it's interesting politically, because they require that every single building be proportional to the ethnicity of the city. You can either say that they really have integration and respect for diversity, or you can say they don't want anybody who isn't Chinese to get together in a single place so that they have political power based on controlling a particular area. And I think both things are true. And you certainly see children in school very mixed. You see it on children in playgrounds, you see their parents, but at the same time, the Chinese are dominant politically, even though they're very careful that the government represent each ethnic group. No, I mean, the deficiencies of Singapore are certainly that it is a top-down system. It's very much the way James Scott describes top-down modernism in Seeing Like a State, and that it could use a good deal more liberalization and a good deal more free speech. And then the worst part about Singapore, and of course this is true more and more in the United States too, if you aren't a citizen or have their equivalent of a green card, you are nobody. And they do have a system of contract labor where you're allowed to be there, but it's very controlled, and this is a workforce that is highly exploited. So I'm not setting Singapore up as an example per se of the just city, but I think that the way that land use is done in Singapore and the way housing is done, and also transportation, which is extremely cheap and which is incredibly efficient. Moreover, they don't develop a part for housing until they put in the transportation infrastructure. So that these are aspects of Singapore which I think are excellent models for elsewhere. There's a sociologist there, Chua Beng Huat, who has written a paper called "Is Singapore a Model?" And he argues, well, its historic circumstances are so unique that maybe it can't be a model. But I think the way in which they treat land use actually could be a model, could certainly be a model in China.
So it's very interesting. So yesterday, as part of the studio, we'd gone on a tour of Mary Ellen McCormick, which is the first or the second oldest public housing development in the country, right? And it's in South Boston. And it was actually quite distressing because it was a complete retreat of the public sector from public housing, and developers are taking advantage of subsidies in an opportunity zone to build market rate housing on this 26-acre site. So it is a question of financing public housing.
Actually, speaking of framing issues, that it should be called an opportunity zone in itself.
Exactly, yeah. But Susan, public housing in Singapore is problematic as well, right? I don't know how it works, but just reading Anne Hyla's work, sovereign wealth funds, I mean, there's a way in which Singapore is extremely extractive outside the tiny boundaries of the city-state. And she calls it the global hinterland, right? The global financial hinterland. So even the public housing in Singapore, it's difficult just given how embedded it is in a very extractive form of capitalism, right?
Yeah, well,
especially when you're thinking about financing of
Singapore is a financial center, and its sovereign wealth funds, which control about half of the Singaporean economy, you could say are exploiting the rest of the world for the benefit of Singaporeans. But at the same time, you can say it is for the benefit of all Singaporeans rather than for the benefit of the 1%. What you have is a wealthy island surrounded by poor countries, and they are able to take advantage of the labor force that those poor countries provide in order to attract firms there who are there because they can, in fact, make use of this cheap labor force. But it's also a place which has very high educational standards for everybody's children, not simply for the children of the privileged, and that it's hard for me to say that somehow if Singapore were poorer, Indonesia would be better off. The other thing you can say about Singapore is it has a government that's really honest in an area which is characterized by a great deal of governmental corruption everywhere in all the surrounding countries.
Yeah, I would add as well, though, that the public housing initially was actually built as or has been argued by Baekhyun Park at Seoul National University, that it was built as a form of labor subsidy, basically, in order to attract international capital to begin with. So, in a sense, it was, I mean, in that sense, it wasn't initially quite so extractive directly. But if I may, I'd like to ask a question too, to go back to some of the early work again, in which Susan addresses, or the sort of orthodox Marxist idea that the state is a tool to be captured by capital. And she argues against it by suggesting that both capital and the state are fragmented, right, as she suggested here. And so capital is fragmented among different sets of interest and individuals, whereas the state is fragmented individually among different levels of government and horizontally across different municipalities, and perhaps also horizontally across different agencies and what have you. And for me, that was, I mean, I guess it shouldn't have been such a surprise, but it was a really interesting for me to read that part. And I'm thinking about it in relation to the contemporary period and whether or not it's worth the effort of social movements or planners to try to enhance fragmentation in order to find new opportunities for influence, or if that works against planners, or how you see this sort of strategy, if there is a sort of strategy of fragmentation that we might adopt in order to achieve a more just outcome or process.
I don't know. I think that planning used to have the idea of being comprehensive, and now it's pretty fragmented itself. So I'm not sure that saying we need more fragmentation, particularly in American metropolitan areas, which are so divided and which essentially the wealthy and developers and firms that want incentives take advantage so much of the competition among places. No, I think it's more that simply the social hierarchy is not simply a hierarchy, but that each stratum of it is fragmented, and that's why we have politics. And if there were simply a single hierarchy, as there is, as you refer to in North Korea, there isn't politics in any overt sense. I mean, I'm sure there is in every place some kind of politics. I think that, as people who are progressive reformers rather than revolutionaries, that what you do is you find whatever space that you can find.
So then, do you want to suggest then that there's a need to build larger blocks of interest to share, to build more common interests in order to sort of materialize a broader range of support, as some people seem to be arguing these days on the left?
Well, are you making the argument?
Oh, sure, I'll make the argument if that'll get a response. Yeah, I would suggest that something like the Just City or some other potentially even more utopian visions can be a tool for bringing fragmented groups under a more common umbrella, and thus to avoid some of the difficulties of say, the Occupy movements and what have
Well,
you?
I've been asked actually to speak to various planning associations in this country and elsewhere, to county officials, that I've been a consultant to one of the London boroughs, and that by doing that, I'm trying to change what they talk about. I interviewed Ken Livingstone after he was mayor of London, and he had plenty, actually, of time on his hands to be interviewed by whoever wanted to talk to him. In fact, he said, "Oh, I'll come to your hotel." He was very happy to have someone pay attention to him. But at any rate, I was working at that time on a case study for the Kennedy School of Crossrail. And he said, well, the only way he could sell Crossrail, which is a railroad that goes from well west of the center of London to well east, was to say that it was going to produce economic growth, that was simply the way you had to talk about it. But actually, Ken Livingstone was, of course, a socialist. He said what I really was saying is what we needed was better public transit for London and for the people who relied on public transit to get around. But one of the questions is, well, if you really have to talk all the time in terms of economic growth and economic competitiveness, you're not changing the conversation. And so instead, he was, of course, succeeded by Boris Johnson. And maybe if he had, in fact, been a little more forthright, it might have been better. I think, yeah.
Questions?
I wanted to piggyback on Sai's bringing up the question of place and the challenge of abstraction in theory and the specificity of place. And I want to bring it up in terms of what we do not as planning scholars, which is how I think you all talked about it, but more as planning educators, so within the school. Because I think the challenge that you put in place is the challenge of the expediency that's required of our short semesters, even if they sometimes seem long to you guys, and how you can fit that kind of fine-grained analysis and ability to telescope out for abstraction, which is why I think you sometimes see the Chicago School circles, right? So I think that question of sort of how do you deal with that challenge in school?
Is that addressed to Sai or to me?
All three of you.
Oh, all right. Well, I've become acutely conscious, and in a way, teaching in Singapore really made me conscious, because there a class would be drawn from many, many different countries. I mean, it was never predominantly Singaporean, actually, that you have to be sensitive to people are coming from different places, and the concerns of a Chinese planning student are simply not the same as the concerns of an American one, and that it's important to, in fact, assign literature that addresses other countries, and that I think here that courses, well, most of the faculty here are kind of globalized faculty, and that it's important that courses incorporate not necessarily other theories, but other places as empirical evidence, that people have to see what they're studying as relevant to the place that they are coming from and that they are probably going to go back to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't teach studios so much, but I mean, the way I see a strategy I see would really be to start with sort of accepting that some of these theories are generated by experiences in particular places. But then once you've worked up to that abstract level, to then try to resituate them in other places, right? So you can sort of, I mean, I think it would be a useful strategy to do that, and then get to the abstract where it is deterritorialized, and then find different ways and challenges in reterritorializing it in other places, right? I mean, particularly now, the gentrification literature is been doing a lot of that, trying to figure out whether it is applicable as an abstract concept in other places, or if it's just plain become too abstract.
No, I do think it is a challenge between place and theory, right? And especially within the short semester. And I was just wondering, there's a brilliant book which came out by Alden Morris, The Scholar Denied, where he looks at Du Bois and the Atlanta School and the systematic silencing because of racist institutions of power of Du Bois's theory. So perhaps what would be very helpful in a very short semester is assigning both the Chicago School, Park and Burgess together with Du Bois, because that's a way really of provoking these conversations, right? So just to get you to understand that all theories are underpinned by some geographies of power.
Start with multiple geographies and then work up to the abstraction, right?
Anne?
I actually want to ask a question about scale, because actually
Sorry, about what?
a scale.
Oh.
So every city that anyone has mentioned today has been large, right? There have been no small cities, no cities without universities mentioned in the term of theorizing. So I wonder about this issue of scale in theory, how you've dealt with it, why you studied larger cities, how you think that how the lessons that you learned from large cities can apply to small cities. It's a different way of cutting the scale question that Sai asked.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is a certain problem of the people who actually get, you're of course an exception because you have studied suburbia, but that people who go into urban planning as a profession tend to do it because they really are interested in big cities, and big cities are exciting, and that then the focus of their research tends to be on what it is that excites them. Actually, of course, Sai looked at highway corridors outside of the big cities, so it's not exactly the case with her that she restricted herself to. She didn't restrict herself to Mumbai, but that I think there is a tendency. Jenny Robinson wrote a book called Ordinary Cities, in which she said that, well, everybody focused only on global cities. I don't think that's true. I think that there's been a lot of interest in cities which aren't the centers of finance capital and aren't the centers of producer services, but that I think you're right. I think there's a real bias in both the theoretical literature and simply what people do research on empirically, because big cities are just more interesting.
Well, we'll find out in Greenville. I don't know, I grew up in a very small rural place, so it was kind of interesting, I think. But obviously ran to large cities. I wonder if it isn't also another form of this sort of geography of place or geography of urban theory, is that in the same way that large cities are sites of production of finance capital or real estate capital or industrial capital, it's also they are also sites of the production of intellectual capital, right? So if we think about these ideas being produced in places like this, and then perhaps being abstracted and then filtering down scale to these smaller cities, where they are applied by people who study at institutions like this, perhaps it's, again, just this question of how theory becomes applied to practice, and that in some geographies are not perhaps as conducive to theory production as others.
Actually, one topic that hasn't come up tonight, but which I think many of us are thinking about a lot, is that there's become politically an increasing I shouldn't say urban-rural divide, but urban non-big city divide, and that this has expressed itself politically. One of the things that always bothers me about the literature and social movements is that there's an assumption that all social movements are progressive. And in fact, we've seen a lot of very powerful social movements which the journalists apply the term populist to them, and I'm not sure that's exactly the term I would use, but that we are seeing very powerful right-wing movements. And when you're talking about democracy, you can't claim democracy only for the people that you agree with. And democratic processes are producing a great deal of right-wing authoritarianism and a democratic desire for authority. So we don't necessarily always want more democracy, or we want our kind of democracy. And I think there's too easy a tendency to assume that if we really had real democracy and real participation, that it would somehow come up with results that were the ones we liked.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this. Thinking back to the original question about connecting theory to practice, I'm wondering about the sort of word theory. And I have no doubt that we, for example, here at the GSD, theorize a lot. And theorizing, you can theorize, it seems, without a sort of real demand about universalization of your results. You can theorize over very limited scopes. But on the other hand, to have a theory definitely seems to argue some kind of broad, perhaps even universal generalization. And I'm wondering if it's perhaps one of the reasons it's so hard to connect theory, urban theory, to practice is because what we call urban theories are the result of theorizing, but aren't actually theories in any kind of Popperian scientific or even quasi-scientific sense. And do we have any urban theories? What is needed to have an urban theory? And is perhaps the challenge of connecting theory to practice the fact that we perhaps don't have any?
Bill Brenner still here to answer that question. He just left. Wise. I think Cuz actually said it fairly well, that you have to constantly move back and forth between abstraction and empiricism, and that one informs the other. When you say everybody has theories, it's just that they don't necessarily make them explicit. And so when you have a theory about how cities develop, you may not state it, but somewhere in the back of your mind it is there. And so what you do as a theorist is to make explicit what is otherwise implicit, but is certainly always there. The great debate for a long time in development theory was, were there stages of growth, stages of modernization? And then that was disputed by the dependency theorists, who all were Latin American, from the global south side.
That's precisely the point, right? That's what the point that I was trying to make, is that dependency theory was speaking back to modernization theory, right? So that's why, again, the category of the periphery was important, right? And
well, you would have to say that any post-colonial country was speaking back to colonialism, but that isn't a way, one could make a generalization about the world, that it was dominated by particular countries, and that necessarily you have to argue back against it, that how would you generate a theory of development that didn't take into account what was the imperial system that went on for a period of time, which formed the modern world as we know it? So, you could go to Marx and say, well, you had thesis and antithesis, but you can't simply say, well, we should ignore thesis because it shows that we're dominated by the thesis. I mean, this is just where we find ourselves. But I think that the theorists who opposed Western theories, I wouldn't say opposed Western theories because they used Marxist theory, all of them, which you could call Western theory. But that, there's a dialectic in the development of theory, so that now I don't know exactly what phase we're in, because I'm not sure that there's been that much new as opposed to kind of elaboration of the theories we've had now for some time. I mean, there's been a reassertion of liberal political theory, and maybe this goes to Cuz's remarks on Hong Kong, but an argument about the importance of democratic processes, and you might say that that's in reaction to the rise that we've seen of authoritarianism in so many places.
So even though the title is the challenge of applying theory to practice, there's an implication that it works that way. The theories affect practice. Could I suggest that actually more often it is the opposite? We haven't talked much about practice, but I would suspect that more often than not, out of practice, theories emerge. And practice is also generally based upon locale. And so out of locale and the practice in that locale emerges a theory. How would you respond to the fact that stuff works the other way as opposed to the implication from the theorists?
Yeah, I think that's true. Well, it goes to this back and forthness, but one of the things that I've remarked to my class is that people who only recently graduated from college are really the ones who don't see any point to taking a theory course. But people who've actually practiced for some time then find it very useful to be able to reflect on their practice and to say, oh, now I really see what I was doing, which was I was just doing it without thinking about it. Yeah, I think anybody who actually is a practitioner at some point needs to and does stand back and say, well, what can I make of this now that I've been a consultant in 10 different places and seen different processes going on? What can I say that might be in general, or what can I say that actually each of these places was completely idiosyncratic? And just sorting that out, I think, contributes to the development of theory.
Yeah, I mean, we might even here's a suggestion that might even tie it to the post-colonial literature idea too, is that in a sense, to suggest that one is prior to the other is to try to position yourself outside of both of them, right? Whether it's outside of colonialism or what have you, or outside of practice and theory. I mean, we grow up and our brains and minds and ideas and practices develop through that constant interaction of practice and theory, right? You know, as a kid, you try stacking the blocks up and they fall over, so you develop a theory about what's going to keep it erect, and then try that out and go back and forth, right? So I would just suggest that we can't get outside of this relationship, and that instead we can just simply sort of bounce back and forth and up and down the scale of abstraction and empiricism, I guess. Which is not to say that we need to be at either one end or the other either. I mean, that's really the strength of the Just City, is that it tries to heave to this sort of more middle course, I think.
Oh.
I'm going to be as quick as I can. 3 points, really. One is, I think, Sai, and you can treat them as comments or questions if you want to respond. Does theory have a geography? And I'd like to sort of add to that, does theory have a time? And what that means, which leads me to Alex's comment, which I'd really like to pick up on, because I think there's a kind of assumption when we discuss theory of it being almost static in it, and that's why the question of does it have a time. And if you see theory and practice as iterative processes that actually create feedback loops that make them both robust because they can inform each other, I think that would be a different imagination. So the challenge for us in pedagogy is how we situate it in that form. Yeah. And then the third question, Susan, and you have to take this in the right spirit and constructively, I'm not being critical. It's really a question, which is, looking at, say, your syllabus, I see of the 64 readings, about 5 that are non-American, and I'm counting Bish Sanyal in those 5. So is it a question then of the problem that Sai was raising, or is it that I use the word majority world instead of global south. A Bangladeshi photographer invented it. It's not my invention. It's just where the majority of the people in the world live. So is the reason for what your syllabus reflects the fact that there's not enough reflection and theorizing and theory that's emerging from the majority world? Or is it a matter of us in the West, within the American Academy, not knowing how to situate that pushback or that speaking back to the theoretical constructs that we've been used to? So these can be treated as comments or questions.
Yeah, I would say that most of the work that actually that's published in the journals I read, published in English, tends to be empirical rather than theoretical, actually. So that, it'll say something like the theory of housing development, then colon, it will then say Mumbai or something, and then it'll actually be all about Mumbai with one paragraph. And so I think there actually isn't that much theoretical literature, except for the theoretical literature that says that there is, people in the West are ignoring the theoretical literature elsewhere. But certainly there was a lot in theories of development that was non-Western. But in terms of actual theories of planning, well, there's a good deal on informality, which I do assign some of. Maybe I'm just guilty of not knowing that literature. One of the other issues that I was thinking about as we were sitting here is the relationship between what would be called urban theory, really going to the question that Mike raised, and planning theory. And and that's not so easy to actually relate theories of urban form and urban development to theories of planning practice. I'm not sure that I can do that easily either. And the people who write on one tend to be only writing on one or on the other and not bringing it together.
Is this recorded? Okay, so I need to be careful about what I say.
But Sai, before you go on,
could just this bit be edited and removed?
Okay, my God, she's going to attack me. But I just want to react to Susan for a second. Susan, just on the question of informality, for example, I just was 2 days ago at a conference in Berlin, and I was amazed at how seriously the city of Berlin is taking informality as urban design planning strategy. So, I think there perhaps has to be a greater effort for these crossovers, maybe.
But I think it is a problem, and there are the journals that we read, right, in terms of institutions of knowledge production. The most prestigious journals that most of us assign in our classes are located in the United States and the UK. And please, we should edit this because it's, Diane and I are editing a special issue, and we have invited scholars from India and Mexico to participate in this special issue. The authors write in vernacular languages, right? They write in Indian languages and they write in Spanish, which means that their research is not being circulated within the English-speaking academy. And this is theories, right? It's some of the most sophisticated theories on urbanization and planning in India and Mexico. So I think it's a bigger question of, I mean, like the resources for translation. It's a huge shift in the way we're thinking about our canons. Because, I mean, it is the hegemony of the English language.
Why does this need to be edited?
Oh, because the special issue actually rejected the journals because they don't have a high enough citation, whatever that, what is that, H or something? That's
score.
That 8, yeah, whatever that neoliberal metric is. They don't have that citation index because they're not being read and circulated in the English-speaking academy. Right? And they rejected these scholars who are pioneering, brilliant scholars in India and Mexico.
What I meant was, why can't it be recorded? Why don't you afraid of it being
Because this, well, if the editor of the special issue sees this, because whoever this editor is rejected these scholars' articles.
Time to conclude.